It's recording, awesome. So, Assalamu alaikum everyone. It's always a bit tricky because usually when we have the quiz, the purpose of the quiz is to remind us of what we covered last week, but now we don't have the quiz. So I'll try to recap. Does anyone remember what we did last week, really quickly? We did the boycott, yeah. Correct. Abu Talib, that's right. And we covered also him, the Prophet ﷺ going to Taif and his experience in Taif, how we met Adas, the Christian slave from Nineveh, and we also covered the first Turkish Muslims, technically, the Jinns who were coming from the city of Nasibin. Now, what you have to bear in mind is that continuing from here, remember that the situation of the Prophet ﷺ is probably the worst it's been so far. It's hit rock bottom. He's lost his two greatest supporters. He's also lost the protection of his clan, and everyone is attacking him, and they are under immense pressure. A lot of the Muslims have gone to Abyssinia seeking protection, and those that are left are being persecuted, and this time with no holds barred, because Abu Talib is not there anymore. So this is the situation we're in right now. Now, while most of the Meccans, or not most, but some of the Meccans were still resistant to Islam, Islam was starting to spread outside of the Quraysh. And you can make sense because, in this culture, everyone was related to everyone in some way or the other. So one tribe was related to another tribe, and they intermarried, and they had all these alliances. So when something happened amongst the Quraysh, it starts to spread. And it was now spreading to the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, which are outside of the Quraysh domain. There's one such tribe called the Ghifar, G-H-I-F-A-R, Ghifar. They're just north of Mecca, so not too far, just north of Mecca. And this tribe was very well known for being highwaymen. That's how they made a living. They attacked caravans and then robbed them. They were a very warlike tribe, and a lot of the Arabs in the area were scared of them. Now, news reaches the tribe of Ghifar that there is a so-called prophet in Mecca. And one man, Abu Dar, hears that there's this prophet, and it makes him curious. So he comes down to Mecca. Now, Abu Dar is also a highwayman. He makes a living by attacking caravans and robbing them. As he enters Mecca, the Quraysh, as per normal, come running to him and say, look, be careful. There's a sorcerer in town, and if you hear his voice, you're going to fall under his trap. So don't go near him. But Abu Dar, being Abu Dar, a highwayman, scared of nothing, this actually piques his curiosity even more. So what does he do? He goes straight to the Prophet ﷺ's house. And as he's nearing the Prophet ﷺ, he hears the Prophet reciting the Quran, and it changes him, and he becomes a Muslim. When the Prophet ﷺ hears that Abu Dar is a highwayman, he laughs. He laughs and he says, verily, Allah guides who He wills. You have all these Quraysh, these elders, these noble people who are respected, discarding Islam, and you have a highwayman who is probably a bandit who's accepting Islam. And even for the Prophet ﷺ, this comes as a surprise. And he actually finds it amusing that, the world is in such a way that Allah can guide whoever He wills. I like Abu Dar. I don't know, has anyone heard of him before? Anyone heard of the name Abu Dar? You have? He was a very close companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Dar is very unique. He started off as a highwayman, rough, tough, wasn't scared of anything. He then comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, let me stay with you after he becomes Muslim. And the Prophet says, no, go back to your tribe. So he's sent back to the tribe of Ghifar, and a lot of the tribesmen of Ghifar become Muslim. So this bandit tribe starts becoming Muslim. Now this is a big problem for the Quraysh, because now what Ghifar is doing is they're targeting the Quraysh, because they're starting to see the Quraysh as the enemy. So it actually works really well in the favor of the Muslims, because now instead of attacking any old caravan, they're attacking the Quraysh, because the Quraysh are attacking the Muslims. The other thing that's really interesting about Abu Dar is that when the Prophet ﷺ sent him back to his tribe, he actually stayed with his tribe. He became the Imam of that tribe for a very, very long time. He didn't come back to Mecca, even though it was quite close, until the Prophet ﷺ settled in Medina. Once he was settled in Medina, Abu Dar comes back to him and he says, look, I've done my job the best I can, I've looked after my tribe, I've been an imam to them, can I serve you now? And the Prophet ﷺ agrees. Abu Dar had the Prophet ﷺ had a very soft spot for Abu Dar. There is narrations where when he comes into a crowd and there's people and Abu Dar's there, the Prophet would smile really broadly to Abu Dar and pat him on the back. And Abu Dar loved the Prophet ﷺ. He was a very brave Sahaba, and he outlived the Prophet for quite a while. He lived through several of the Khalifats as well, and he died a very old man. The other really unique thing about Abu Dar is that he was very close to being an ascetic. He was totally against worldly possessions. Interesting, a robber becoming totally against worldly possessions. He used to go up to the caliphs and tell them off if he seems that they're getting a bit rich or they're getting too much money. And even when he passed away, he was living in a very small hut. And at one point, the Amir of Syria said, how can a Sahaba, one of the most beloved of the Prophet, be living in such destitute state? I'm going to send you some money. And he sends Abu Dar some money, and Abu Dar sends it back and says, don't you have anyone better to give this money to? Why are you giving it to me? This is the changing effect of Islam, that it can bring a robber who's pretty much lives to collect and steal money, and it turns his back on the world completely. Anyway, so that was one of the converts that have happened. Another convert was a person by the name of Tufail. Now, Tufail came from a tribe called the Daws, and the Daws were quite far south. Unfortunately, I had a map where you could see where the tribes were. I don't have it. But they were very far south. It took several weeks to travel from where the Daws was to Mecca. But it just so happened that Tufail was visiting Mecca at the time, and he was a famous poet. And the Quraysh said the same thing to him. They said, there's a sorcerer, if you listen to his words, you are going to fall for his trap. So what does Tufail do? He immediately goes get some cotton wool and plugs his ears. And so he walks around Mecca with cotton wool in his ears, scared that he's going to fall into this magician's trap. But one day he sees the Prophet ﷺ praying, and he thinks this is very interesting, seeing him pray. And he's like, I wonder what he's saying. So he takes his cotton wool out, and he hears the Quran being recited, and he falls in love immediately. So in a sense, it did happen. He did fall under a spell, technically. And Tufail becomes Muslim. Now, interesting thing with Tufail, the Prophet ﷺ tells him the same thing that he told Abu Dar, go back to your tribe and tell them about Islam. Tufail goes all the way back south to his tribe, quite a distance, and tells them, you have to become Muslim. Islam's the right way, you got to do it. Only his closest family become Muslim. No one else pays any attention to him. So he's very stressed out and he's wondering what's going on. So what does he do? He comes all the way back to Mecca and he asks the Prophet ﷺ, what am I doing wrong? Why is no one accepting this? And the Prophet says to him, return to your people, call them to Islam, but deal with them gently. Tufail wasn't dealing with them gently. He was saying, you have to do it. It's the truth. Why can't you see? The Prophet said, that's not the way. So he sends him all the way back, all the way south to his tribe. And a lot of the tribes from the Daws, after Tufail starts treating them gently, starts to become Muslim. So it's a lesson for us as well. When dealing with non-Muslims, the Prophet's sunnah was always to teach Islam in the most gentle manner possible. Now, so we dealt with a few things, but then we're heading to an area which is going to be incredibly important to Islam. And the people here are starting to hear about the Prophet and Islam as well. Do you know what I'm talking about? Any idea which area I'm talking about? We're outside of Mecca now. We're talking about things happening outside of Mecca. Yathrib. News is spreading in Yathrib that there is a Prophet there. Now, a little bit about Yathrib. Yathrib was not like Mecca. Mecca was actually a proper city. It was spread out. There's buildings for different things. Yathrib was not. Yathrib was a span of arable fertile ground, and what it was is it was captured between a lava plain. So there's lava plain all around on 3 areas, and in the middle was fertile ground, and in that were these tribes. But each tribe had a fortified hermitage, not a hermitage, what do you call it? A hamlet. So all these tribes would be living in little hamlets. So it's like each tribe would have its own fortified area. That was Medina. It wasn't technically a city or a township. It was a series of hamlets put together. There were 5 main tribes. Anyone know the names of the 5 main tribes of Yathrib at the time? Aus and Khazraj, the two Arab ones. What was that? Quraiza, Kainuka, Nadir. Three Jewish ones. Quraiza, Nadir, and Kainuka. Now here's the thing with Medina. A lot of people I didn't know this until I started doing the Seerah. The land, majority of the land in Medina was owned by the three Jewish tribes. So the Arab tribes were renting the land from their landlords. It was a feudal system almost, in every essence except name. The Arab tribes were almost paying homage to the Jewish tribes. And they had, the Aus and Khazraj had a massive inferiority complex because of that. The big guns in Medina were the Jews. But the other problem was the Aus and Khazraj were constantly at each other's throats. They were constantly fighting. And the fighting had got so bad that it almost became a civil war. Now, amongst the Jewish tribe, in the tribe of the Quraiz, am I saying that right? Quraiza, lived a pious, saintly man by the name of Ibn al-Hayban. Ibn al-Hayban was a person who kept telling to anyone and everyone who would listen, there is a prophet coming. All the science, everything I've studied, he was like a rabbi. Everything I've studied, there is a prophet coming. And when this prophet comes, follow him. Unfortunately, Ibn al-Hayba had passed away before the Prophet ﷺ came. But a lot of people remembered it. A lot of the Jews remembered it, but a lot of the Aus and Khazraj remembered it, because what the Jews would say is, you better not become too big-headed. You better listen to what we're saying, because if you do, we're going to have a prophet who's going to come and we're going to teach you a lesson. This was the constant threat that the Jewish tribes were giving to the Arabs. There's a prophet coming, and as soon as he comes, we're going to teach you a lesson, so you better listen to us. So when the news reached Yathrib that there was a prophet, there was quite a few people, Jews and Arabs, who started asking, could he be the one that Ibn Hayban was talking about? Anyway, at this stage, the Aus and Khazraj had got to such extremes of fighting that it was a civil war. It's interesting, that even to this day, I've heard people say, if only the Muslims united, if only the Arabs united, they're always subordinate to the non-Arabs or the non-Muslims. History repeats itself. The Aus and Khazraj are at each other's throats, even though they have everything in common, genetically, language-wise, everything in common, and yet who is pulling the strings and controlling them and in charge of the three different... Sorry? Correct, they were selling weapons to both sides, and they were using proxy wars. If the one Jewish tribe didn't like the other Jewish tribe, instead of fighting each other, they would send their Arab allies to fight each other, so that the Jews weren't losing out. So this was the situation in Medina at the time. Right, so because of the civil war that was happening, there was a delegation. Aus and Khazraj said, we got to sort something out or we're going to be annihilated. So they sent a delegation down to Mecca to ask the Quraysh to arbitrate for them. And so while this delegation was sitting around waiting for the Quraysh to see them, the Prophet ﷺ comes to them. And he says, I know what you have come here for, but will you allow me to give you something better? Can I provide you something better than what you have come here for? And they say, well, tell us what it is. And the Prophet ﷺ tells them about Islam. And the youngest in that delegation, a person by the name of Iyas ibn Muad. Does that ring a bell? Iyas ibn Muad. He's the youngest person. He's a fairly young boy. He stands up and says, I accept Islam. The rest of the delegation berate him. They say, you're a fool. What do you know? You're so young. Shut up and sit down. He is the first Yathribi Muslim. Unfortunately, soon after the delegation returns back to Medina, he falls sick and he dies very young. Iyas ibn Muad is the brother of Sa'd ibn Muad. Ring a bell? I'm not sure. I feel like it's Aus, but we'll find out. Very close companion of the Prophet. But it's his brother who was the first Muslim in Medina, and he died very young. Now, another thing happens. See, the thing is, when you read a Seerah book which is not much into detail, they say there was a war in Yathrib, and the people in Yathrib or Medina invited the Prophet ﷺ to come and lead them. That's literally, if you learn. That's not exactly how it happened. It happened over many, many years, and the Prophet ﷺ had to chip away very slowly at them. The first chipping away was then this delegation came. The second was that during Hajj, 6 people from Yathrib came down to Mecca, and they were doing Hajj, and the Prophet ﷺ went to them as well and told them about Islam. And some of them had heard directly from Ibn Hayban about a prophet, so they immediately remembered. And they tell the Prophet ﷺ this: "We have left our community, for no tribe is so divided by hate and enmity as they are. Allah may cement our ties through you, so let us go and invite them to this religion of yours. And if Allah unites them in it, no man will be dearer than you." So they don't accept Islam, but they say, this might be a way out of our civil war. Let us go back to Medina and start telling people about him and his new religion, and maybe we can find a solution to the civil war. So you can see the Prophet ﷺ very slowly chipping away. This particular incident is known as the pre-Aqaba pledge. Remember that word, Aqaba. Next week, we won't get a chance to do it this week, but next week we're going to talk about Aqaba. The first Aqaba's pledge and the second Aqaba pledge. Very, very important in Islamic political history. It is these 2 pledges that cement Islam as a political power and with a center in Medina. And we start changing from a ragtag group of new religious converts to a real force to be reckoned with. So remember that name, but we won't get there yet. All this time, since Khadija passed away, the Prophet ﷺ was a single parent. Right? Remember, so from that time to this now, the Prophet ﷺ is still a single parent. He is telling people about Islam. He's trying to tell the people from Medina about Islam. He's trying to tell the Quraysh. He's trying to keep the Muslims together. He's trying to protect the Muslims from that. He's trying to look after all his kids, 6 kids, and the 2 adopted kids, all by himself, with no help at home. Can you imagine? Sayyid is adopted. He's a little bit older. Ali. Ali was not adopted, but at his household. Correct, but very young. It's stressful. It is hard on him. And the Sahaba start to see how hard it is on him. He doesn't have any support, no protection. And on top of that, he's being persecuted. If you're a single parent, or if you've had that feeling of hardship, at least be glad you're not getting people throwing things at you and persecuting and threatening to kill you. The Prophet even had that on top of it. No Centrelink, nothing. He was living off what people provided for him and his children. A Sahabi by the name of Khalwa sees this. Now, wait, I jumped ahead. At this time, the Prophet ﷺ has a dream. He has a dream, and in the dream, he sees someone carrying a person wrapped in silk. And he puts it before the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ removes the silk, and it is ISHA. And the person says, "Here is your future wife." He wakes up, but he wakes up troubled. He doesn't like this idea not because Aisha is so young. There is a big age gap, yes, he is aware of that as well, but because Aisha is already betrothed. She's already engaged to someone. By several years she's been engaged now. So he doesn't tell anyone this. He keeps it to himself. The second night, he has the same dream, but this time he sees an angel bringing this person, puts it before him and says, "Here is your future wife." And it is Aisha again. Again, he doesn't say it. This is very interesting. We're talking about the Prophet ﷺ, so we know for a sure fact that he knows that it is a sign from Allah, right? But he's also human. His human nature is like, "Oh, this is not going to be good. This is going to be trouble for me." So he keeps it to himself. He could have said, "Allah's going to deal with this. I'm going to go tell everyone." He didn't. He kept it to himself. At the same time, this Sahabi, Khalwa, comes to him and says, "I can see you're struggling. You have all these kids. You have all these things to do. You're doing it all by yourself. Why don't you get married again?" And the Prophet ﷺ says, "Who shall I get married to?" And he said, "I have 2 proposals. 2 people I think are very good potentials. One is Sauda. Sauda bin Zama was a Muslim, a Sahabi, and her husband had passed away. She's 30 years old. And the other one is Aisha." So it matches up. The interesting thing with the Seerah, even with the prophets, is that there are certain things that are bang in your face. The Quran, the Revelation, splitting of the moon, no denying it. And there are other things where things just fall into place at the right time. And this was Aisha's situation. Khalwa says this, The Prophet ﷺ says, okay, send the two proposals to both and let's see what the families say. So Khalwa goes to both families. Sauda's family is overjoyed and says immediately, yes, no problem. Abu Bakr has a problem. On one hand, it is the Prophet. How can you refuse? It's his closest friend. On the other hand, his daughter is already engaged. It's dishonorable to marry her to someone when he's already engaged. So he starts to hesitate and he doesn't know what to do. Note that till now, I have not said that anyone had a problem with her age. No one's having any issues. There's no concerns. There's no questions being asked about the age. Just at that time, a message comes to Abu Bakr from Aisha's engaged, proposed husband's mother, so future mother-in-law, saying, I don't want Aisha to marry my son anymore because I'm worried that your daughter will convert him to Islam. Okay? So the engagement's broken off. And so the message goes back through Khalwa, yes, she's not engaged anymore, she can marry you. And the Prophet ﷺ marries her. Now,
so the Prophet marries her in Mecca?
In Mecca. Engagement, yes. Also, something to note is that the Prophet ﷺ, after marrying her, actually, they live separately for 5 years. Some scholars say about 5 years, some say some years. They don't live in the same household. To the point that it's Abu Bakr who comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, why don't you take she's your wife, take her to your house. And that's when the Prophet ﷺ takes her to a house. Now, I can stop here and we can continue with the seerah, or I can do something I promised myself I'm not going to do, but there has been benefit in doing it last time. So I'll tell you a bit of a story. When I was doing the kids seerah and we got to this point and I was going to continue, one of the girls, 14, 15, said, hang on, how old was Aisha? Because I've heard she's very young. Is that right? And she put me on the spot, so I had to deal with it. Now, I am happy to talk about this if you would like, because it is a thing that a lot of people have, a lot of questions, especially young people. On the disclaimer that you agree and you accept that this is not my opinion, there are very, very pious, very knowledgeable scholars who've talked about it, so I will try to give you their scholarly opinions, not mine. I'm not a scholar, I'm not a ustad, I'm not a sheikh. The only sheikh I have is the milkshake I drank. There's nothing there. So if you agree with that disclaimer, we will talk about Aisha's age and what happened there. Yes? Agreed with that? I've got that on video, not my opinions. All right. There are two theories, okay? There are two theories. The first theory goes based on what Aisha narrated. So the only hadith, or the narration we have, sorry, not hadith, the narration we have of Aisha's age when she married was from Aisha herself, correct? But there are two sahih chains that go from that. Al-Bayhaqi reports that Aisha said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam married me when I was 6 or 7 years old. Okay? But Al-Zuhri and Hisham ibn Urwa, so that chain, both said that she said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam married her when she was 9 years old. 6 or 9. Both of these are sahih. They're in Bukhari. Okay? So the first theory is that she was actually 6 or 9 when they married, not consummated. Remember also, even after that, there was quite a few years where they weren't together, and it was a few years after that, there was a consummation. Couple of things with this, right? The scholars, when they say we're going to deal with this, they talk about a couple of things. The first point, it was not the Prophet ﷺ or any other Sahaba that suggested that Prophet ﷺ marry Aisha. It was Khalwa. So, that implies that it was very common. It was not a problem in anyone's sight at the time. The second thing was, not even the Quraysh who would find anything to go off at the Prophet, anything they can find, they'll go after the Prophet, chose this as a weapon to attack the Prophet. There was never mention of the Quraysh saying, you married an underage child or you married a kid. Okay? Now remember, we're still talking about one theory, so bear with me before you jump to conclusions. We're going to get to the other theory that scholars have talked about. The third thing, Abu Bakr hesitates, and he says why he hesitates, not because of the age, but because she was already engaged. And the other final point for this is that Aisha was already engaged several years before she married Prophet ﷺ. So I'm going to read something from Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, if I can find it. Okay. Now this is in regards to theory 1, right? We're still talking about theory 1. The fact that Khalwa tells him to marry Aisha is very indicative of the fact that this was not an unusual thing in their culture. Obviously, in modern Western culture, this would be completely shocking. In most modern anthropological methodologies, one is expected to try to remove one's social frames of reference when one is examining another culture, because it is unfair to superimpose one's own prejudices upon another culture. Each culture has its own traditions, its own ways of doing things. And if you try to force upon it your own ideals, your principles, and what you feel is acceptable, then you end up being unjust towards another tradition. This was a normal thing in their society. Nobody was shocked by it, and it was just part of their culture. If you look also in the Oxford Dictionary of the Bible, it says that they think that Mary was probably 12 and 14 years old when she married. They recognize this was the age when a woman got married in that culture. This was also very normal both in Hebraic and Semitic cultures, and in most parts of the world, including in China and India. It is really modern society that has extended the age of marriage. There's an important book by Neil Postman called The Disappearance of Childhood, and one of the things he writes is that childhood was in fact an invention of the Renaissance Europe. Prior to Renaissance Europe, children became adults about the age of 7 or 8. Islam extended the age for military service to 15, which in that time was radical because we know that there were children in the Crusades. Obviously now, if we apply these same standards, a 9-year-old to us is a child, but a lot of that has to do with our own socialization. In other words, expectations we have of them. If you go into the village of Morocco, for instance, responsibilities are given to young people at a much earlier age than they are given in the cities. You'll find in villages somebody who is 8 or 9 years old is already living an adult life and adult responsibilities. So you shouldn't try to apply standards we have of today for a 9-year-old to a 9-year-old in the 7th century Arabia, because there is actually no comparison. There was very mature people at an early age. Neil Postman points out that modern education really has extended childhood. The adolescent phrase is a creation of the modern world, where postmodernists would call an artificial construct. Adolescents in the culture, 7th century Arabia, were adults. Usama ibn Zayd led an army at the age of 17. He was an adult, and that's how they viewed it. It was a very different world. That is a scholarly opinion on theory 1, which is that she was either 6 or 9, based on the fact that the chains of narration we have are sahih. When we say sahih, does everyone know what I mean by sahih? So we have different levels, right, in a hadith. So we have sahih, daif, weak hadith, strong hadith, different levels. Fabricated hadith, yes. Now, the strength of a hadith is not an indication of whether it's 100% true or 100% false. It is an indication of the source and who passed it down to who and who passed it down to who. If you can follow that source very clearly and you can tell who said what, and you know the personality of each person in that chain, so we know he's not a liar or he's something, that is what makes it strong. Does that make sense? So a weak hadith could still be true. It's just that when the hadith came down to us, we're not sure about certain parts in that chain. Does everyone follow me there? But in this case, this one is quite strong because we know the chain, we know everyone, and in both chains, and it comes from Aisha. So a lot of scholars say, let's go with that. Now we're going to go to theory 1. Okay, we're going to go to theory 2, sorry. Theory 2 is that Aisha was actually much, much older than 6 or 9. And there is quite a bit of evidence for that as well. 1. I'm going to start with the evidences that are kind of weak in my opinion, and we'll work towards the stronger ones. The first one. It's a bit odd that the future mother-in-law of Aisha would say that we're going to break this engagement off because I'm scared that she will convert my son. A 6 and 9-year-old trying to convert someone older than her doesn't really make sense. It's more likely the other way around. So that's one of the weakest evidences that the scholars have put. During that period, people did not know their exact ages from other examples. We see number was used as a descriptor rather than the exact age. Now, there is a hadith A hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said to his companions, "We are unlettered people. We do not write or calculate. The number of days in the month is thus and thus." Now, when he said the first thus, he went 20. So he showed this. So that's 20. Sorry, that's 10. And then he showed 10. And then he did this, 29. So thus and thus. Right, sorry, thus and thus, 29. Or thus and thus, 30. So what I'm saying is, when we talk in our culture, when we talk about months, we have to show our hands, because numbers in itself does not really compute with the Arab culture. They are visual people. They need to see things. And this is from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Numbers such as 29 and 30 may have been difficult for his audience to grasp without visualization. Supplementary quantity. In this case, the Prophet's fingers. From this, we see numbers weren't specific figures, but indications. For example, my back hurts. I feel like I'm 100 years old. You're not really 100 years old, but you're saying that. Even in our culture, even Western, you're so young, you're a baby. Well, you're not really a baby. We're just saying you're like a baby. Also note, some scholars say Khadija wasn't 45. Possibly wasn't 45. The reason being is that when she married the Prophet ﷺ, she was 45, but she had 6 children after that. It would be very, very hard if you get older to have 16. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. A lot of scholars say that she was 45, and it is. But this is something that the scholars have considered, that that age of 45 may have been a reference to the big age difference between her and the Prophet ﷺ, not necessarily her exact age, because it's very hard to say exact ages back then. So what some scholars are actually saying is that when Aisha said 6 or 9, she's indicating that she was very young compared relative to the person she was marrying, but not necessarily 6 or 9 exactly. But there's even more evidence that starts that up. Al-Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, said that Fatima was born while the Kaaba was being built, and the Prophet was 35 years of age at the time. And she, Fatima, was about 5 years older than Aisha. We can assume that this statement of Al-Abbas is reliable, as he remembers the birth of his nephew's daughter taking place while the Kaaba was being rebuilt, and we know quite well when the Kaaba was built. This report indicates that Aisha was born approximately when the Prophet ﷺ was 40, i.e. at the commencement of his prophecy. Therefore, she would have been at least in the minimum 15 when the marriage was consummated in the second year after Hijrah. So there's evidence that now she's going from 6 to 9 to probably 15 or older, if you do maths calculations compared to other historical dates. Another thing, Ibn Ishaq. Anyone remember Ibn Ishaq? I said in the first week, I said if you don't remember anything, remember his name, Ibn Ishaq. He is the Seerah, the first person to compile the Seerah into one source. Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham both state, Ibn Hisham's another Seerah scholar, both state explicitly that Aisha was amongst the earliest people to embrace Islam, and they make a list of 51 early converts. That list does not have a single child. The opinion of Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham indicates that Aisha must have already been of an age when she was able to understand and accept the new faith, and therefore she would have been well into her late teens when the marriage was consummated. So that's another piece of evidence. Another one, Asma was 10 years older than Aisha, and she was born 27 years before the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ. According to this, Aisha's birth would have been 4 years before the commencement of prophecy. So she would have been 19 years of age when the marriage was consummated. This is further supported by Ibn Kathir, who stated that Asma, the sister of Aisha, was 10 years older than her and died in 73 AH at the age of 100 years. Simple mathematics shows that this also equates to 19 years of age for Aisha in the second year of Hijrah when the marriage was consummated. So you see, it's not that easy. It's not as simple as saying, oh, she said 6 and 9, was she 6 and 9? All right, and there's a few more things that we'll go through. Al-Bukhari. Now, when we say Al-Bukhari, what do we know? It's Sahih. The hadith is Sahih because all the hadith in there is Sahih. So Al-Bukhari narrates that Aisha said, I was a playful girl when the verse, nay, the hour of judgment is the time promised then, was revealed. Okay, so she's saying this statement, I remember, and I was a playful girl. Now, the Tafsir of Ibn Ashur says that this surah was revealed 5 years before Hijrah. Okay, the use of the term girl, the Arabic term is jariya. In this hadith, rather than the term sabi, which means child. So she said, I was a young girl rather than child. Is significant as jariya in classical Arabic means young woman above the age of adolescence. According to this, Aisha would already have been an adolescent 7 years before the marriage was consummated. So she would have been post-puberty 7 years before the marriage was consummated. Also the fact that she remembers this verse, which couldn't have been the case if she was 6 or 9 when she was when married, because at the time the verse was revealed, she would have been 2 then. She couldn't have remembered the verse if she was 2. That's what some scholars say. Another hadith in Sahih Bukhari states, on the day of Uhud, I saw Aisha, I don't know who says this actually, I don't know which but a Sahaba says this. I saw Aisha, the daughter of Abu Bakr, and Sulaim with their robes tucked up, so that their bangles around their ankles were visible, hurrying with water skins on their backs. They would pour water into the mouths of the people and return to fill the water skins again, and come back to pour the water in the mouth of the people. As Uhud took place an year after the marriage was consummated, this would make Aisha only 10 years old. The description, however, does not seem to be right for a 10-year-old girl, and it is extremely unlikely that a girl of 10 years would have been allowed onto the scene of the battle. The Prophet ﷺ did not even permit several boys to join the battle. If you remember, the Prophet ﷺ was in his early teens when he first set sight on a battle. And even then, he was only picking arrows. He wasn't allowed to fight. He wasn't allowed to help. In this case, the girls were actually being nurses. They were helping the wounded and injured. So if a boy who is 15 is not allowed to do that, 14, 15, the question is raised, would a girl who's 10 be allowed to do that? As they were too young. The descriptor does fit for a young woman in her late teens or early 20s. So we're now in a situation of, how is this the case though? We have it in Sahih Bukhari, right? Why would it be in Sahih Bukhari if we have mathematical evidence or chronological evidence that doesn't fit? So some of the scholars point to another thing. They say, the chronology of many famous events in the life of the Prophet ﷺ are subject of different opinions, even for something as important as the length of the Meccan period. We find that Ibn Abbas states that the Prophet ﷺ remained in Mecca for 13 years, and then he migrated. However, Rabia ibn Abi Abdul Rahman says he stayed in Mecca for 10 years, receiving revelation, and then went to Medina for 10 years. Both these hadiths are in Sahih Bukhari. Right? So there's an issue there. Both are Sahih, both are in Sahih Bukhari, but they both say a different time frame for how long the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca. I'm going to digress a little bit because this is my favorite topic, and I'm going to get myself in trouble, I know. We hear a lot, a modern thing of, oh brother, you don't need scholars. We have Sahih Bukhari, we have Sahih Muslim, we have Sahih Tirmidhi. Well, why do we need scholars? Because of things like this. You see the evidence that even in Sahih Bukhari, we have really good, strong Sahih hadith. No one's saying that they're not right or true. But how do you interpret them now? Because one's saying one period, another's saying another period. Aisha herself is saying in one chain 6 years, in another chain 9 years. The hadith's strength is in the chain, not in whether it's true or not, or the context of it. It doesn't explain any of the context. So for someone to say, just follow Sahih Bukhari, we don't need scholars, it's like saying, let's just read a medical journal, we don't need doctors. Correct. And even Imam Bukhari, when people tried to get fatwas of him, he would refuse. He said, I'm not a faqih, I'm a muhaddith, I'm a scholar of hadith, will not give fatwas. So just bear that in mind. And this is a little, tiny example of the importance of scholars when we even talk about Aisha's age. So why are we now left with this issue, right? Why are we left with this issue? There is a theory. I'm reluctant to say this theory because it is a theory made by a Western academic rather than an Islamic scholar, but I thought it was interesting. There is a theory that earlier Sunni scholars actually preferred the age 6 and 9 hadith for a reason. Because at that time, there was the issue with the Shias. Right? And the Shia had a strong argument as to why Ali and the progeny of Ali should have been the successors, and they were refusing Aisha. Because one of the reasons they were saying is Ali grew up in the household of the Prophet as a child. Therefore, his progeny has more right to be the Khalif or the next Khalif. And of course, we know Shias do not accept Aisha's narrations or accept Aisha as a good person, astaghfirullah. Now, the view is that perhaps at the time Sunni scholars emphasized this hadith because that was a counter to the Shia scholars, because it's now saying Aisha was also very young and Aisha also grew up in the Prophet's household. This is a Western academic theory as to why those hadiths were held. I'm not saying it's right, I don't know, I just thought it was interesting, but there is a lot of scholarly debate on this. There has been a lot of scholarly views. Very great scholars accept theory 1 and very great scholars accept theory 2. And there's arguments for both these.
I guess as Muslims, like, we accept whatever the Prophet did, it was inspired by
Correct.
whatever.
Correct. Correct. And the only reason I'm touching on this is because while that is true, if in a community like this, when you go out, you still have to deal with the questions and you have to still deal with the things, especially the young people like that girl in my Sunday class who had to deal with it and had to, and saying, well, the Prophet did it, just wouldn't go with them. But, correct, yes, yeah. Okay. Are you feeling exhausted? Because I'm feeling really exhausted. That's a lot. It's dense. And I don't have good news for you because the next thing we're going into is even more dense and even more big. So if you're ready, we'll go. Otherwise, we can stop here. What's your view? It's up to you. We're doing Isra and Miraj. Very important. Continue with Isra and Miraj. I'll do it quickly, but there's a lot here. Okay, we're good? We're going? We're going, all right. The Prophet ﷺ now has married Aisha and has married Sauda, and he would visit his cousin quite often, Hani. Remember Hani? She was the one that Prophet ﷺ proposed initially and Abu Talib turned him down, Hani. But they still remained close. It was his cousin, so she would visit him, and Hani's husband was not a Muslim, but he was quite supportive of the Prophet and was very hospitable. So Hani and her husband would invite him to come and lead the evening prayer for their children who were Muslim. One such day, he was there, and he was resting in Hani's house, and he had a nap. He got up and decided to go to the Kaaba. And it was his tradition, similar to his father, Abdul Muttalib, to sleep near the Kaaba sometimes. So he went, and he fell asleep at the Kaaba. He suddenly feels a prod on his ribs. He wakes up, and there is no one there. He thinks it's a bit strange. He goes back to sleep. Another prod. He wakes up, no one is there. Third time, a prod. And this time he wakes up and he sees Jibreel standing before him. Jibreel stretches out his hands, picks the Prophet ﷺ up and walks him to the gate of the Haram, one of the gates. And when they near it, he sees this creature. This creature he describes as half mule, half donkey, white with wings. Now, let's just stop there for a second. It sounds very fantastical. Like a Pegasus. Yeah, and when I first heard it, it was like, But if you know the Bible, there is a very similar creature in the book, I believe, of Daniel. There is a reference to a very similar, actually there's three creatures. There's a bull, there's a lion, a human, and a horse, I think, with wings. And this is a vision that Prophet Daniel has. There is a connection there. Very similar creature that the Prophet ﷺ seeing. I don't know if it's the same. Allahu Alam. I'm not saying it is, but... And Jibreel tells the Prophet ﷺ, get on top of him. So the Prophet ﷺ gets on top of this creature, and the creature is known as, anyone know what the creature is called? Burak. Jibreel says this is a Burak. And they set off. The Prophet ﷺ says that every stride of the Burak was from where you stand to the horizon. Every stride. And they head towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem is 1,223 kilometers away from Mecca. And they travel it in one night. This journey from Mecca to Jerusalem is what we call Isra. Okay? They reach Jerusalem. Now, the Prophet ﷺ has never been to Jerusalem, ever in his life. He reaches Jerusalem and he goes to the Dome of the Rock. There is a particular spot, actually, if you Google it, they have a little hut, or not a hut, something, a monument created to where the Prophet ﷺ actually stood. And he sees all the prophets, or most of the prophets that were on this world before. He sees Musa, and Isa, and Idris, and Enoch, Yusuf, and Yunus. They're all there as they were when they were in this world, as they looked when they were in this world. And they gathered together to pray, and they asked him to lead the congregational prayer. High honor. Really high honor. Can you imagine? All the prophets of history saying, you lead the prayer. And he leads the prayer. After the prayer is led, each of the prophets starts to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the end, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also praises. And he says this is the Prophet's praise to Allah. Praise to the one who sent me as a mercy to all the world and for all humanity, as a warner and a bringer of good tidings, and who revealed to me the Quran. It is the clarification of everything. And he made my ummah the best ummah that has come out of people. And he made my ummah the first and the last. And he expanded my breast. And he removed the weightiness from me. And he raised up my remembrance. And he made me the opener and sealer. That's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful praise. It's such a beautiful praise because he talks about us in the praise in Jerusalem in front of all the prophets. That's pretty heavy things. He talked about us in Jerusalem in front of every prophet in history, and he praises Allah. I get goosebumps every time I think about this. And then Jibreel comes back and he says, get back on Burak. He gets back on Burak, and this time instead of going horizontal, they go straight up, vertically, right through time and space. And now we're getting, this is very hard to describe in the Seerah because all this time I've been talking about the physical mostly. We are now going into the realm of metaphysical, the supernatural, the beyond time, space, three dimensions. He's going through the 7 heavens. And each of the heavens, he meets the prophets again. But this time, the prophets are in their celestial form. They're not the way they were on this world. And the Sahaba asked him, can you describe? And he gives a few descriptions. He says, Prophet Yunus had the beauty and the glory of a full moon in all its glory. His face shone like the full moon in all its glory. He said, Prophet Adam, when I looked, one side of his face was happy. He was beaming with happiness. But then he turned and I saw the other side of his face was weeping and sad. And he was pleased for all his descendants who were doing good and obeying Allah, and he was weeping for all his descendants who had turned away from Allah. So there's a few, I'm not going to go into these, but he sees these celestial forms of the prophets. And they keep going through the 7 heavens. And they finally reach a place where the Prophet ﷺ appears to be a tree. And this tree is so bright, it is glistening and it's with light, and it's so bright that no one can look upon it except the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ looks at it, and Surah Najm, verse 16 and 18, if you remember, please go home and read, refers to this about how he was able to look on this tree. Interesting side note, the tree is a very, very common thing in every culture. The Celtic culture used to call it a tree of life. I'm not saying it's the same tree, I don't know, but it's an interesting thing, the tree of life. Hindu culture, Indian, Chinese, every culture has this concept of a celestial tree. The Prophet ﷺ refers to the tree he saw as the Lot tree. And he says this was the final thing on the edge of the universe and time and space. And Jibreel tells the Prophet ﷺ, I cannot go beyond this, but you must. And the Prophet ﷺ goes further, and he meets what can be further than all time, space, and the universe, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he meets Allah. And here, 2 very, very, very important things happen. Very important to us. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 285 is revealed. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 285 is the summation of our entire creed. And it came directly from Allah. It didn't come through Jibreel, it came directly from Allah. verse 285 of Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 285. And I'll read that to you. And it goes like this. The messenger believes in what is his Lord revealed, as do the faithful. Each of them believe in God, his angels, his book, and his messengers. We don't consider one of his messengers as being better than another. We hear and we obey. Your forgiveness, our Lord, for we know that our final destination is back with you. That's an amazing surah to be revealed in that spot. It is the summation of all that we believe revealed directly, without Jibril involved. The second thing is the prayers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, tell your ummah that they must pray 50 times a day. 50 times. The Prophet says, okay, no problem. He goes back. So he goes back, and as he's coming back, he meets Musa. And Musa says, what happened? Tell me what happened, because I haven't been there, you've been there, what happened? And the Prophet ﷺ tells him, I met the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he says 50. And the Prophet, Musa was like, oh, I know my ummah. I know how hard it was for me with them. They're not going to be able to do 50. You have to go back. Can you imagine how the Prophet would have felt? You know, have you ever had a situation where you had to tell your parents or your teachers something really difficult, that feeling? I remember I got my report card, and it was not a good report card. And I was waiting for my mom to come because she had to sign it, and I was walking backwards and forth. This, I assume, is what the Prophet felt times 100. But he went back for us. He went back for the love he had for us. He went back to the creator of the entire universe and said, please, bring it down a bit. And it was reduced by 10. And the Prophet comes back, and Musa says, like, you can't, they can't do it, go back. And again he goes back, brings it down by 10. And again, backwards and forth. Can you imagine the stress the poor Prophet ﷺ was under for us? Finally, he comes with 5, and Musa says, they can't do it. 5 is too hard for them. And the Prophet says, I will not go back. I am too embarrassed. What my Lord has willed, I will resign to it. He's like, I cannot do this. This is too embarrassing for me. But it's something for us to remember. The Prophet ﷺ went through this hardship with the creator of everything, and yet sometimes we struggle to pray for 5 times. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that yes, they pray 5 times, but I will still give them the blessing of the 50 that I asked them for. It's incredible. Finally, I will end with this. And this is a beautiful reference by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. He says this. This was the turning point. One of the things to remember about this is that this happens at a point where the Prophet ﷺ is at his lowest point in the dunya terms. Allah is teaching us something extraordinary. The Prophet ﷺ has no wealth. His beloved wife Khadija is gone. His protector Abu Talib is gone. He is completely in a state of dejection in his own city, and Allah is raising him up to this incredible status. Once you've seen what the Prophet ﷺ has seen, what significance does all of that dunya have? He's seeing this whole other realm of reality, the unseen world, and the next to it, dunya just loses all significance. Once you've experienced this, and you have prayed with the prophets, talked with the prophets, seen them in their celestial beauty, gone to the Lord tree, gone beyond what even Jibreel can do, gone backwards and forwards with the yes, it was hard for him, but suddenly you can imagine for him, the death of Khadija, the death of Abu Talib, all the persecution is a shadow compared to this. And this is why the scholars say Allah chose this time. He could have done it from as soon as he said Iqra, this experience should have happened. But it was this time to raise him up and to solidify Islam and to really bring home the message to all of us, really. And we will, inshallah, stop here. And next week, we will continue. Thank you. Welcome, Sam.